Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to the Absolutism and Enlightenment lecture. We're going to take a look at absolute rule, what it looked like, some examples of absolute leaders around the world in this time period of 1450 to 1750, and maybe how absolutism emerged as kind of a dominant way of leading. And then the answer, which was Europeans' Enlightenment movement, which was the movement more toward democratic type of governments with concern for fairness and equality. So let's start with a definition of absolutism. First of all, an absolute leader, in most cases, especially in Europe, was someone who claimed some sort of divine right. And the divine right theory says that essentially the king or the leader is God's representative or is somehow ordained by God to lead. Therefore, obedience to this leader means obedience to God, and you don't want to make God mad, so you do what the leader tells you to do. The king, therefore, could also do no wrong, and so the king was kind of exempt from being nice because the king was doing what God would have them do. So, the characteristics of enlightenment. Sorry for these sounds. I don't really love all these sounds. What does it look like in practice? The title of leader is inherited. It's not earned. It's not voted on. Nobody can kind of say, let's vote for the next king. It's inherited through heredity, right? Heredity, inherited, yes. So decisions of the king are also final. The king doesn't have to consult anybody in order to make decisions. The king or the queen can kind of do whatever they want to do, including internal and foreign affairs. The people, in almost all cases of absolute rule, don't have a voice and don't have a choice, and therefore are treated kind of at the mercy of their leader. So Louis XIV is kind of the embodiment of all things absolute. Louis XIV was probably the most famous king of France, probably the most famous leader of France, led for basically over 70 years since he was a young boy. And so was the most powerful ruler in French history. Said, and pardon my French here, "L'état c'est moi," which is the state, is me. I am the state. I am France. I am everything. And so he took on the title of the Sun King, was extremely concerned with his own comfort and luxury, made a lot of advances in France, but also made a lot of decisions that ended up kind of crippling France in the years to come and would lead to, in just the aftermath of his rule, lead to the French Revolution and kind of a movement toward democracy. Engaged in mercantilist practices, which was very protective practices of France's own economy to advance their own economy, and was obsessed with control. Here is some images of Versailles with some very nasty sound effects in there. This is the palace that was built for King Louis. It's still there. You can go visit it in France if you'd like to. Extremely opulent. This is your tax money at work. But again, if the king is the representative of God, well, then this is fit for a king. Louis XIV also engaged in wars for the expansion of French power. And the growing French power was kind of dominated by Louis and his spending of money in order to expand France. Some more a map showing the members of this Grand Alliance, which were attempting to kind of neutralize French expansion. And you can see the arrows are for French attacks. So France was concerned with expanding their influence, and the rest of Europe was concerned with trying to balance power to make sure that they weren't too strong. This is during Louis's wars. Other absolutes in history. Let's take a look at a few at this time period. Elizabeth I from England was a woman, obviously, and unified the religion of the English people, was able to hold off the Spanish Armada in 1880 to 1588, I believe it was, and then kind of had some constant struggles as a woman leader at this time. Other absolutes, Philip II of Spain, who was unsuccessful in leading the Spanish Armada against England, but had the power of the Catholic Church, which the English were not Catholics, so there were some battles there. Peter I from Russia, or Peter the Great, was attempted to westernize Russia and create a more Western-looking culture in Europe, and was kind of an awesome leader in his own right. Rebuilt a new capital, St. Petersburg, and moved the capital city. Remember, the absolutes can do no wrong. And was concerned with making sure that Russia grew. So under him and earlier czars, they had expanded into new territory. In Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu, or Ieyasu, I think you can say it either way. I don't know. My Japanese is also probably worse than my French. So, was the emperor who unified Japan after the feudal period, where the daimyos were kind of at war with one another. This quote, "What is good for me is good for my son," kind of meaning that the emperor as father of Japan, and provided Japan with more stability than the feudal era of Japan. And then in China, Kangxi was an emperor in 1661 of the Manchu dynasty, was able to kind of rein in government expenses, and was, reasserting Confucianism by using that examination system to make sure that the best people were in power. So absolute rule doesn't have to be necessarily a bad thing. It can unite people as well. It's just not democratic. China was also in the period of isolationism during this time, up until the British invasion, which we'll talk about in our next unit. In the Gunpowder Empires of the Middle East and in India, Suleiman the Lawgiver, here from 1520 to 1566, was leader of the Ottoman Empire, was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, so military and political ruler. Used a Janissary force as advisors and leaders of the military. In another Gunpowder Empire, the Persian Empire of the Safavids, Abbas the Great rose to power and kind of came to dominate political control. There was known as kind of the greatest absolute ruler of the Safavids. Was able to curtail some of the power of the Redheads, which was the Shia militant group who had kind of formed the dynasty of the Safavid Empire. Was able to punish corruption in government and gave loyal officials power. Was somewhat against the Ottomans because of their religious differences, the Ottomans being Sunnis and the Safavids being Shia. So we see the power of the leader here, Abbas the Great, tied to God again. Enlightened despots were those who were used some ideas that were of fairness and equality in their methods of ruling. So Catherine the Great earns the title of enlightened despot, even though she didn't do much to change the laws of Russia. She did create a commission which got to look at the laws before they were enacted, and was more tolerant of other religions, which is different from most of the absolute monarchs. Akbar in the Mughal Empire tolerated many different religions and enjoyed listening to other religions, religious ideas, and even attempted to create a religion himself which would unite all these religions, and was able to govern through a bureaucracy, which is a slight check his power. So the Enlightenment was an attempt to kind of dethrone, sorry for the pun, these absolute monarchs in Europe especially. So in the 18th century, these Europeans started to say, well, maybe we can take some of these principles that we have learned from science and the fact that there are some scientific laws that will allow us to explain how humans act the way that they act. And so uh, they were attempting to kind of define human nature and therefore see the best way to control it. So a lot of different ideas, but it was all based on the idea of rational logic. So reasoning up until this time. Until this time, the people just said, you know what, we are an absolute monarchy and this is just how life is, this is how it should be. But the philosophes, or the philosophers of France, got together, and they were all mostly upper class men who would talk with each other and figure out, hey, maybe we should do something to change the unfairness of this system. Baron de Montesquieu was one of these Enlightenment thinkers. His main idea after this time was that you needed to separate power into three different branches. And so instead of just having one principal leader who got to decide everything themselves, Montesquieu wrote in the Spirit of Laws that there should be a separation of powers. So, quote from Montesquieu: "In republican governments, men are all equal. Equal they are also in despotic governments, in the former because they are everything, in the latter because they are nothing." So, showing that the equality of men in a republican government, which is where essentially democratic type of government, men get to be treated as equals because they get to make the rules. In an absolute monarchy, they are equals because they are all basically under the foot of the absolute monarch. Voltaire was another Frenchman who wrote a lot. He was kind of like the Saturday Night Live writer of the time. His quote here is, "It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong," thinking again that the government, the absolute monarch, can punish you however they feel like it, and your freedom of speech means nothing to them. And his second quote: "The art of government is to make 2/3 of the nation pay all it possibly can pay for the benefit of the other third," meaning that the elites are kind of keeping the rest of society down, and that the rest of the society should be able to rise up and assert themselves. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract and said, "It's unfair that some people are rich while other people are poor. The rich should not enjoy special privileges." This is kind of uh, a basic principle of the Enlightenment, that people need to be treated with fairness and equality. How to exactly do that is what the democratic governments that formed after the Enlightenment tried to do. And so the most famous of these is, again, the United States of America, which was founded on a lot of the beliefs of these Enlightenment thinkers. So, some final conclusions. Absolutism was good because it brought order, stability, some national pride. Was not only used in Europe, but in a lot of other places at this time period and before this time period. And was pretty obviously favoring some at the elite level of society over others. An enlightened type of government was one that was going to bring about change and begin these ideas of revolution, political revolution, which would kind of start a chain reaction of overthrowing, which we're still seeing to this day, overthrowing despotic rulers in favor of more democratic leadership. So these are some of the final lasting things from the Enlightenment. Be awesome.